The French and Indian War, often remembered as a battle between European empires. A struggle for control over North America between Britain and France. For the indigenous nations caught in the middle, it was a war of survival. One that would reshape their lands, alliances, and future.
The 7 Years' War is the most consequential conflict for Native people in North America in the history of European colonization of the continent. It's the most important single war because it really changed the destiny of American Indian people across the entire eastern part of the continent.
In the mid-18th century, the British and French controlled large portions of North America. They had fought each other for territory on the continent in a series of wars that lasted almost 100 years. In 1754, land disputes in the Ohio River Valley sparked the beginning of the final war for control of the continent. 2 years later, Great Britain declared war on France, marking the beginning of a global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Various Native American nations allied themselves with both sides during the fight for North America, but most sided with the French.
The most important thing to understand to start with is how the French and the British were different with regards to indigenous people, with how they approached indigenous people. They were both Europeans. In a lot of ways they had similar cultures, but the way they went about colonizing North America was fundamentally different, and the fundamental difference was how they related to Native people. With the British, they established what we'd call a settler colonial frontier. They arrived in New England, in the Chesapeake and Virginia, with the goal of recreating England, essentially. Very intensive settlement along the coast, these sort of communities with lots of settlers where they would build farms and sort of hive off over decades and generations, and sort of eventually this place would recreate and look a lot like what England looked like. We call that settler colonialism, colonizing with the goal of settlement. As far as where Native people fit in English settlement, they didn't fit. They were imagining a colony, a future that did not have Native people in it. So it meant they were very aggressive in how they colonized, and they were very exclusionary. We call it sometimes a frontier of exclusion. They excluded Native people from their society and how they were going to live. The French were fundamentally different. So the French, the way they colonized, so the English are along the Atlantic seaboard, New England, that sort of thing. The French, their settlement heartland is along the St. Lawrence, from Montreal to Quebec and into the Great Lakes. The fundamental thing about the French is they had way fewer colonists, just a tiny fraction of how many the British had. There are a lot of reasons for that. It just wasn't as attractive a proposition to come to the Americas to settle for the French. So when the French colonized, and during the exact same time period, the 17th, 18th century, they had to figure out, how are we going to preserve our presence in these new lands that are new to them? And the answer to that was not excluding Native people, but including Native people in their empire. We call this a frontier of inclusion. They imagined a future that was not necessarily equal, but one that included Native people in it. Be that as trading partners, the French were really involved in the fur trade. It was essential to everything they did. Be that as Catholic subjects, the French were very aggressive in establishing missions, or, especially important as we talk about the 7 Years' War, as allies. The French relied upon Native allies to survive, because they only had a few thousand Frenchmen, a few thousand French people in this entire part of the world. So how are they going to survive against their perennial enemies, the British? It's allying and relying on Native people for support. So we call that a frontier of inclusion. It's not equality necessarily, but it's imagining indigenous people as part of the future of how the French are going to be in this continent. So from the indigenous perspective, from the perspective of Native people, most Native people preferred the French to the British. The French were not aggressive colonizers of land. They generally would establish a fort someplace, and traders and diplomats and missionaries would kind of fan out from there. But they didn't take huge portions of land and clear cut the forest and build farms and push Native people out. They almost never pushed Native people out. They kind of brought Native people in as allies. So Native people preferred that for very obvious reasons. The French would also provide gifts as a way of maintaining these alliances. So giving gifts to indigenous people, indigenous leaders, was a way of currying favor for the French. They would also trade, sometimes even trade at a loss with Native people as a way of maintaining their favor and their alliance. And finally, it was in indigenous people's interest to keep the French around, and they preferred the French because if they ever needed to, it was easy to dislodge the French or to make the French do something or to push the French out because there just weren't very many of them. So all of that is absolutely essential for understanding the 7 Years' War and what Americans call the French and Indian War, because the French and Indians, so-called Indians, were generally allied for very clear reasons because they relied on one another, whereas the British were separate from that.
The fighting between the British and French in North America largely ended in 1760 with the fall of Montreal, and officially ended when the 7 Years' War came to a close a few years later. While the British celebrated their victory, the Native Americans were left to face an uncertain future.
The consequence of the war was shattering this imperial balance that had existed prior to the war. This British and French balance that Native people understood and they relied upon. By the end of the war, with the Treaty of Paris in 1763 and the expulsion of the French from North America, Native people had to confront a completely different reality. For so long, there had just been this sort of push and pull between the French and the British, and the Native people of North America, of Eastern North America, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, the many nations of the Great Lakes region, the people of the Ohio River Valley, they had relied on that balance to maintain their grasp on these homelands, playing the two sides off of each other, being valuable sort of in-between trade partners or allies. It allowed them to maintain who they were and survive during a period of huge trauma and disease and all of this. The French are gone, that all explodes. The British colonists believe this is their moment. They have finally expelled the French and they've defeated their native allies. They suddenly have this right of conquest, this legal and moral imperative to spread across the continent. And this is really the moment when this idea that's later called manifest destiny, this is the moment when that spark, when that really becomes central to who Americans are and who they become. After the French and Indian War, there is this enormous push to expand into the Ohio country and into upstate New York. There's this huge push to expand across the Appalachians into these new lands. And there's enormous resentment towards Native people. And a big part of justifying moving west and ultimately justifying the American Revolution was demonizing Native people, delegitimizing the Native claim to that land, making it so the Native claim to those homelands is somehow inferior, impermanent, or immoral. Saying, oh, these lands aren't really inhabited, or these people are just savages, they don't really use the land. And the 7 Years' War, among many wars, added an element of, well, they're our enemies and they're barbarous. So therefore, there's a moral claim to this land. So that was really important. So a big part of the 7 Years' War, as the native people allied with the French, is to demonize native people and to emphasize the violence done by native people. That's a way of getting British officials back in Great Britain, or even in the colonies, British settlers, on board with the war and on board for pushing the native people and pushing the French out of there so the British can move in. So emphasizing things like massacres, inflating the numbers of massacres, emphasizing cruelty, scalping, even though scalping was something done by Europeans as well, and encouraged by Europeans on both sides. Emphasizing those sort of things was in the British interest, because once the war is over, once the French are defeated, in the eyes of the British, it gives them the moral authority and legal authority to move into the Ohio country, to move into upstate New York and take the land from native people, which is why this is one of the most important, maybe the most important conflict for native people in all of their history, is because it really opens the floodgates to British and later American expansion west, into the West. The other thing that I'll say here, when we talk about native history with native people at the center of it, that native people are involved, during this time period, when we look at sources, when we look at documents from the 7 Years' War, from the 18th century, from the 17th century, pretty much every single one of them that we read, not all, but almost every single one of them, is written by a non-native person. It's written by a European or a European colonist. So how do we get to the native voice? How do we know how native people understood what was happening during the 7 Years' War? When we have almost no accounts written directly by native people, we don't have recordings, we don't have interviews with native people from that time who are saying, this is why I'm doing this. That is the fundamental challenge of native history. And it's really, really difficult. There are tools that we can use as historians, understanding the cultural context for native people, understanding their culture, understanding how they might have viewed things or understood things, talking to descendants, talking to members of those communities today. These were oral traditions. These were oral cultures. They passed down their history by word of mouth. So getting at histories that way is a really important way of seeing the past. And just trying to understand that whenever you read one of these European accounts, which are valuable, those are valuable, but understand and always keep in mind they have a perspective in mind. They have an agenda, as any human being does when they write anything down. They have an agenda. They have interests. And the story they tell almost inevitably is going to serve those interests in some way. It's not objective reality, whatever that is. It's going to serve them in some way. So always understanding that, understanding what they say about what native people did and why they did it, isn't necessarily the whole story.
If you enjoyed this video, check out some of the other videos on my channel which cover a wide variety of subjects. If you want to keep up with what I'm working on, head over to my website and sign up for my newsletter.